For some, isolation can sound like a dream come true. Time away from people, freedom from distractions, and a break in the monotony of life. In theory, it's an opportunity to focus on what's important. Such as writing a novel. But is there such a thing as too much peace and quiet? According to psychologists, the answer is yes. Strip us from stimuli and the mind can go into overdrive. It becomes restless and anxious. Our sense of time and reality warps. Paranoia sinks in. From the maddening confinement of Old Boy to the social alienation of Taxi Driver or the desperate loneliness of Castaway, popular culture has depicted the effects of isolation in a multitude of ways. But of the many examples, few show the terror of its reality quite as well as Stanley Kubrick's psychological horror classic, The Shining. Was it really all work and no play that made Jack a dull boy? It is difficult or impossible to study scientifically the impacts of culturally produced social isolation at the human level. In the 1950s through to the 70s, American psychologist Harlow was scandalous for his experiments on rhesus monkeys. His cruel tests varied from raising an infant monkey with a surrogate mother made of wire to complete social isolation, raising them with zero human or non-human contact, and then introducing them into society. In one of his most infamous studies, grimly known as the Pit of Despair, Harlow wanted to simulate the effects of isolation on monkeys that had already formed bonds with their mothers. Baby monkeys ranging from 3 weeks to 3 years old were torn from their mothers and abruptly placed in a small, black, inverted triangle container where they were left completely alone. The length of seclusion varied with each subject, ranging from 3 to 12 months. Some were tested with stimuli such as white noise or occasional unpredictable sounds. And then, without warning, they were released back amongst the other monkeys in the lab. The tests left them socially obliterated, stunted from developing emotionally, disturbed, and unable to properly function. Some would sit rocking, inflict harm upon themselves, or even starve themselves to death. While some monkeys were able to be rehabilitated back into society, others suffered permanent damage to their psyche, leaving them unable to reform bonds or causing them to lash out violently. Most of Harlow's work was deemed highly unethical and controversial. Thankfully, his experiments were condemned, which resulted in a complete reform of ethics in using animals. But still, the experiments offered a rare insight into what isolation can do, and even for humans, the effects aren't all that different. In 1951, Donald Hebb led an experiment at McGill University Medical Center in Montreal to test the effects of prolonged exposure to a monotonous environment. The volunteers consisted of male college students who were each paid $20 a day to spend as much time as they'd like, secluded in a small cubicle with a comfortable bed. To lower the sensation of stimuli, the subjects wore translucent visors to diffuse light and blur their vision. They wore cotton gloves and cardboard cups to restrict their touch, had a U-shaped rubber pillow to keep their head in place, and were accompanied by a continuous hum from an AC, which was meant to mask small sounds. Some of the young college students saw this as an opportunity to review their studies or plan future term papers. But within a matter of hours, it became difficult to think clearly for any length of time. Seclusion began to get the best of them. The subjects became restless, started singing and talking to themselves. Over time, some grew paranoid that the testers were working against them and trying to make their experience in isolation harder. Their sense of time would warp.
What time is it?
And their sleep patterns would change.
It's about 11:30.
They would start to hallucinate, seeing light, lines, and shapes, and imagine completely impossible scenarios like animals or even seeing people appear. Some would hear sounds, while others would feel sensations like they were being touched. In other cases, subjects would experience a split personality and have intense irrational fits of rage. Woodburn Heron, a collaborator with Donald Hebb on the experiment, concluded that a changing sensory environment seems essential for human beings. Without it, the brain ceases to function in an adequate way, and abnormalities of behavior develop. Strangely, according to a New Scientist article published in November 1985, the research was funded by the CIA as a means to test isolation as a form of torture and even brainwashing. The study left its participants in an unstable state of mind, disoriented by their surroundings, all symptoms Jack Torrance exhibits throughout the duration of The Shining. One of the things that horror stories can do is to show us the archetypes of the unconscious. We can see the dark side without having to confront it directly. In The Shining, Jack Torrance takes a job as a caretaker of a remote hotel during its off-season in the hopes of writing a novel, and even from its opening shot, the movie sets a trembling sense of seclusion. The camera sweeps across an open stretch of land, following Jack's car into thick forests, up perilous mountains, to the ominous hotel buried in the remotest parts of Colorado. The journey impacts the same feeling of isolation that Jack is undergoing, as his descent into a deep and dark part of his mind begins. But it's not just Jack who experiences the extreme effects of isolation. Upon meeting the hotel's general manager, Allman, he learns the fate of his predecessor, Delbert Grady.
He put both barrels of a shotgun in his mouth. Police, I thought that it was what the old-timers used to call cabin fever.
Before Jack can take the role, he already begins to display signs of instability. Following his interview and getting the job, Jack displays a hostile tone towards his wife, Wendy, and son, Danny, while driving up to the Overlook.
I'm hungry.
Well, you should have eaten your breakfast.
A drastic change from the faux charming nature shown during his conversation with Mr. Allman, not to mention the prior conversation between Wendy and Danny's doctor, concerning his past anger problems and alcoholism, including a story where he dislocated Danny's arm. While claiming to be on his way to recovery, Jack's behavior feels to the contrary and tends to exemplify lingering malevolence and resentments, suggesting that his problems seem to run much deeper than just his relationship with alcohol. Jack hopes that the peace and quiet is precisely what he needs to write his book. As the days pass, it isn't long until his behavior begins to change, and his sense of time seems to shift, a similar symptom to the subjects in Hebb's McGill University experiment. He then tells Wendy that he needs to get some writing done. However, the scene that follows shows Jack, completely alone, not working, but instead chucking a tennis ball at a wall over and over and over again. This invokes a sense of restlessness, boredom, and heightened anxiety, akin to the test subjects who began singing to themselves. Jack, like the students, came in with an agenda. In his case, he wanted to write a novel. For the students, they thought they'd plan lectures and papers. Yet, like the test had shown, Jack is incapable of concentrating on his work. He wanders aimlessly around the hotel, restless until the model of the hedge maze catches his eye. He stops and stares down at it, while also looming over Wendy and Danny, who are simultaneously going through it. Jack's actions begin to feel unnatural and misleading, and the maze feels symbolic of the line between real and surreal blurring. Jack's verbal reasoning begins to decline, most obviously when Wendy innocently interrupts him while he's writing.
You're distracting me, and it will then take me time to get back to where I was.
And while it was made clear that Jack had anger issues, his reaction to her presence is absolutely irrational, which makes his interaction with Danny moments later all the more concerning. His jarring change in personality from unreasonable anger to discomforting affection for his son, who he's otherwise been hostile towards the entire film, insinuates a split personality, which was brought up as one of the disorders to explain the paranoia and hallucinations Hebb's subjects experienced. From the very outset, the symptoms of Jack's deep-rooted personal issues and the pressures of writing his novel are magnified by the isolation. It all begins to erode his psyche, cracking and splintering it. And so, Jack begins to experience what can only be interpreted as psychosis, a severe mental disorder in which thoughts and emotions are so impaired that contact is lost with external reality. A common symptom for defining grievous mental illness or insanity, often resulting in hallucinations and delusions. Jack casually wanders into the hotel's ballroom, the Gold Room, and marches up to the empty bar, which is where Lloyd, a mysterious bartender,
What'll it be?
and dozens of bottles of booze in the supposedly dry hotel suddenly appear. The room is eventually filled with roaring 1920s guests, and Jack isn't even remotely fazed by it, especially after bumping into the previous caretaker, Delbert Grady. The events are isolated from the other characters, insinuating that what Jack sees is a product of his own psychosis, and not a product of the supernatural like Stephen King's original novel insinuates. As the film builds towards its climax, more and more the insanity feels collective among the family. Despite Wendy knowing about Jack's erratic nature, she has a dependency on him as her and Danny's sole provider, and so sticks with him regardless of the torment he puts her and their son through. But following more of Jack's outbursts and the discovery of what Jack's actually been writing, she too begins to see things. Jack fully loses his mind and taunts Wendy with threats and baseless accusations, until she finally defends herself, cracking a baseball bat into his skull. It isn't until Wendy endures an intense and overwhelming amount of terror she sees what could be interpreted as stress-induced psychosis.
Great party, isn't it?
Which infers that she too is going mad. While we can still analyze the film, it's important for us to note the lingering element of the supernatural, which is much more prominent in the novel. Supernatural aspects, without a doubt, still exist in Kubrick's adaptation.
How'd you like some ice cream, Doc?
What's less clear is Jack's relationship to the supernatural. At no point in the film do Danny or Jack see or experience the same things, making it questionable whether Jack is being affected by the supernatural or if what he sees is a product of psychosis. Even when considering Danny's run-in with Room 237, we never actually see Danny strangled by the woman in the bathtub. We only see Jack's amorous encounter. Was it Kubrick's intention to make Jack a madman all along? Kubrick is infamous for the obscene amount of detail in his films, often leaving ambiguous clues that allude to other theories. Like the addition of Jack reading a Playgirl while waiting to get a tour of the hotel. A magazine you certainly wouldn't find sitting around in a hotel lobby. More curiously, that particular issue features an article titled "Incest: Why Parents Sleep with Their Children." Years later, fans would dissect this as a deliberate hint that Jack was abusing his son. Stanley Kubrick's film is notoriously divisive among fans of the original novel, and especially to its writer, Stephen King. Understandably so, after all, there are many differences between the two, most notably Jack Torrance. Both King's and Kubrick's Shining portrayed Jack as a recovering alcoholic with anger issues, but in the novel, and the TV adaptation penned by King himself, Jack is an easy mark for an evil supernatural power, which possesses him to try to murder his family. But as we've dissected, in Kubrick's movie, Jack's descent into madness isn't overtly induced by the supernatural, despite throwaway lines about the hotel's origins.
The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
And to further qualify the differences, Kubrick supposedly threw away Stephen King's original screenplay for the film before even reading it. The film sulks in its atmosphere and ambiguity. Few things are overtly explained, making it a fascinating piece to dissect and interpret. One contradicting factor in Kubrick's Jack Torrance not having involvement with the supernatural appears nearly 2 hours into the film, when he's let free from the pantry thanks to the spirit of Delbert Grady. However, Kubrick stated in an interview with the Washington Post in 1980 that the plot for The Shining is just the story of one man's family quietly going insane together. Kubrick's interpretation of The Shining is possibly more notorious than the book it's based on. After all, its broader impact on popular culture is simply undeniable. Several iconic moments from the elevator scene, the all work and no play line, and the maze to
Here's Johnny!
were all unique to the movie, and not in the original novel. Ironically, dissecting Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining can be maddening in and of itself, as it consistently demands its viewers to see and reinterpret the movie over and over, contrary to how otherwise minimal and straightforward the story seems. But of its cryptic tones and alluring theories, what's most strikingly apparent is Jack Torrance's character, and how masterfully Jack Nicholson captures the gruesome symptoms of isolation. As Harry Harlow reported, despite his vile practices, it is undoubtedly true that it is impossible to study the scientific impact of isolation on a human level. And as demonstrated with monkeys and even the McGill experiment, depriving us of what we inherently rely on can be beyond catastrophic to our minds and health. So certainly, Jack is something far more complex than just a dull boy. Thank you so much for watching. Learning about Harry Harlow's experiments for this episode was a little soul-crushing, but it made me appreciate The Shining all the much more. Thankfully, next week we're talking about Jackie Chan. And yeah, this is a laser disc. Anyways, thank you again. See you next week.